Hello listeners, this talk is about two related topics. The first is the recent referendum in New Zealand about possibly changing their flag. And the second is about recent developments in attempts to change the history of Australia. I believe that these issues are related to one another, not just because the two nations involved are located in close geographical proximity, but also because they share a similar ancestry or origin, their history, their culture and so on, are basically derived from British history and British culture and so on and so forth. And I believe that these two issues were or are attempts to undermine that common history and origin and so on and so forth. So I'll deal with the referendum about the New Zealand flag first. The current design of the New Zealand flag is essentially the blue ensign, which is a British naval flag, plus a representation of the Southern Cross, which is a constellation found or seen only from the Southern Hemisphere. And it's actually an image that appears on many different flags, not just New Zealand, also Australia, but some other flags as well for nations in the Southern Hemisphere. So the blue ensign is essentially the flag minus those stars. It's a naval flag, as I mentioned. Now, the referendum itself occurred in two parts. The first part was to determine which potential new design should compete against the existing design. And that referendum occurred between the 20th of November and the 11th of December in 2015. There was a voter turnout of 48.78%. And at the end of that process, a competitor was decided, and that's the black, white and blue silver fern design. The flag, as you can see from the picture, is quite similar to the existing flag, except instead of the Union Jack, basically, in the top left corner, which represents the British origins of New Zealand, they replaced that with a fern, a silver fern. That's a plant that is found in New Zealand, and it also has a lot of connections, particularly to sporting teams in New Zealand. And so there's a lot of popularity there because of the association with sporting teams and so on. Now, the second part of the process was to determine whether to keep the existing flag, essentially the blue ensign with the Southern Cross, or to adopt that new flag with the silver fern on it. There was a turnout of 67.78%, and that process occurred between the 3rd and the 24th of March. So it basically finished a week ago today. So here are the results. 56.6% of people voted to keep the existing flag, and 43.2% of people voted for the silver fern design, with the remaining 0.2%, I assume, voting informally, so spoiling their ballots or something like that. So the existing flag is going to be kept. So here are my thoughts on all of this. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, this attempt to change the flag, I believe it's an attempt to change the history and alter the way people in New Zealand regard themselves and their origins and all of that sort of thing. It's an attempt to erase the British past to some extent. In this regard, there are actually a lot of parallels with the removal of the Confederate flag in the US last year after Dylann Roof killed a number of black people at a church. These things are, and this has occurred in history also at various times in history. Flags are, of course, a representation of a people and their culture and their history and the way they think about themselves and so on and so forth. And so if you can change symbols, flags being a particular symbol, then you can, in a very real way, change the way people think about themselves. And I believe that all over the world, but particularly in former British colonies or the Anglosphere in general, there are attempts to change flags so that people will not see themselves as being of a particular origin. So I think that this is certainly the case with the New Zealand flag. Now, obviously, it's a good thing that the existing flag won, so that they will retain the blue ensign with the Southern Cross. That's a good thing. But to me, it's still worrying that 43.2% of people voted for the new design. That's not that far beneath half the population. I mean, maybe eventually they'll have another referendum on this. But I'd like to sort of analyse those numbers. I think some of this may be to do with SJWs and other assorted lefty idiots, or it might be to do with immigrants. I actually think probably not so much immigrants, actually. One argument that's often made for new flags is that the existing flag with the Union Jack basically represents only British people. It doesn't represent the entire nation and all of this sort of thing. I actually don't think that immigrants really care about that issue. It's used by lefties, but I don't think immigrants generally care, to be honest. Likewise, I don't actually think that this is to do with Maoris, the indigenous Polynesian populace of New Zealand, voting against the existing flag. They only represent 14.9% of the population. So, you know, that would still entail a lot of the white people in New Zealand voting against the existing flag. And New Zealand's white populace is overwhelmingly descended from people from the British Isles. So people with British origin, obviously. Mostly I think that a lot of this can be explained by New Zealand's general proletariat culture. And it's not just New Zealand that has a proletariat culture. I think Australia very much has a proletariat culture as well. But I think a lot of this can be explained by New Zealand's proletariat culture because, as I mentioned earlier, the silver fern is often associated with sporting teams from New Zealand. So the All Blacks rugby team, the cricket team, and I think there's another team that also uses an emblem that contains the silver fern. Probably the netball team, I think. So it's often associated with sporting teams, and New Zealanders are fairly obsessed with their rugby team in particular. So I believe it's kind of a clever way of associating the new flag with that rather than sort of the lefty SJW thing. But, you know, I've spoken before about sports ball and how I don't really get the whole obsession with sports ball in many countries, particularly the Anglosphere. It's a real thing in each country. They all have their particular codes of sports ball that they play and that people obsess over. I think it's sort of it's a false consciousness, I think, to a certain extent. And it's one of the few remaining kind of safe outlets of cultural or national pride in many countries. Hence why we see this spectacle every 4 years of of normally extremely posed Europeans, such as Germans, for instance, getting very excited about and caring so much about the World Cup for volleyball competition, and really making a big deal about it. But if at any other time you wanted to talk about national symbols and so on with them, they'd start getting very cagey about that. So I think sports ball is kind of an outlet. It's a sort of a misdirection, if you like, for national spirit and all of this sort of stuff. But, you know, it's a real priority in a lot of countries, including New Zealand. You know, they're really obsessed with their silver fern emblazoned sports ball players, essentially. Now, why? You know, New Zealand has actually produced a number of famous inventors, doctors, and scientists Why not identify themselves as that? Because whenever you go abroad, if you run into someone from New Zealand, and this is also the case with people from Australia to some extent, it's very much the case with white people from South Africa. I've really noticed this. You always see these guys out and about in some random country wearing their national sporting team's uniform. You know, they have like a rugby jersey or something like that. And they take great pride in this, and you'll see them at sports bars, you know, watching the Rugby World Cup or something in some random place like Taiwan. Though I've seen them in all sorts of other countries also. Why is it that all of these people really define themselves by that? Why don't they define themselves by, for instance, their Nobel Prize winning chemists and so on? So, for instance, New Zealand has won 3 Nobel Prizes for the non-POSD prizes. By that I mean I'm not including literature or peace, but for actual real things. And probably the most famous son of New Zealand is surely Ernest Rutherford, who was the recipient for the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1908 for his research into radioactivity. And he's considered by Encyclopedia Britannica to be the greatest experimentalist since Michael Faraday. So, you know, why doesn't New Zealand define itself by those kinds of things? And you might say, well, you know, that's all in the past. Well, actually, they had a Nobel Prize recipient in the year 2000, so within a generation. You know, why don't they define themselves in those terms? Why do they always go to the proletariat culture, you know, in places like New Zealand or Australia and other countries in the Anglosphere, and even some other countries also. But it's a particular thing in the Anglosphere. I don't know why that is exactly. Well, you know, I mean, I guess it's a safe outlet, you know, something like that, as I discussed before. Regardless, hopefully this referendum will settle the issue about the flag, at least for, say, a generation or something like that. And hopefully by then everything will have come to a head and SJWs will be on the nose. Also, coming out of this, hopefully it will have a flow-on effect for Australia and the Australian flag, and basically shut up these idiots in Australia who have been pushing for a similar change for a number of years now and have become increasingly shrill with each passing year. So, for instance, this year, on Australia Day, which is the 26th of January every year, which commemorates the carrying and adopting of civilization, the mantle of civilization to an entire continent, when people from England settled Australia in 1788 and established civilization in a place that had never felt its glories before. On Australia Day this year, I had all these clowns or friends of friends on Facebook LARPing about changing the Australian flag and so on, because it represents the colonial past and, you know, the oppression of the Aborigines and all of this sort of thing. Hopefully it will shut these people up, because they'll see, well, if we push for a similar thing, we might lose, just like New Zealand did, and then that will take this off the table for at least a generation. I don't know. Now, on that topic about dealing with these people who like to signal about how they're good progressives and so on, I don't usually argue directly with them, so I won't try to say, oh, you know, the Australian flag doesn't represent bigotry and, you know, all of this sort of stuff. I don't play that game, because that's a losing game. You're on a hiding to nothing if you start playing that game. They love that, and they're used to that, and they're very well versed in dealing with people who try that. And they use all of the usual devious tactics and so on. And they get you on the defensive, and you basically just buy into their frame, and you're never going to win that kind of argument with them. So what I do, and what I did with these idiots on Facebook a few months ago on Australia Day, Civilization Day, is I said, oh yeah, look, I agree entirely. I think that the Australian flag should be changed. It does represent a tie to the English past and all of this sort of stuff. I think it doesn't go far enough, though. We should probably remove the Westminster parliamentary system, English common law, maybe modern science. And then I go one step beyond that and I say, I think that anyone who has a British surname, and I have a British surname, because I noticed that most of the people, or actually all of them in this particular post or thread or whatever on Facebook, they all had British surnames, right? So it's all these idiot white people LARPing, right? About how bad their ancestors were. So I say, well, anyone who has a British surname should be forced to change it because their surname represents, their name, their very name, and maybe even their first name should be changed as well. Their very name represents bigotry and a connection to a colonial past and all of this other stuff. So agree and amplify. Don't get on the defensive and don't say, no, it doesn't really mean that, and we can all have something in common from this. We're all the inheritors of this. This great system that we have and all this thing. Don't try to go there because you're not going to win that argument. Just agree and amplify. The reason for this is generally I don't try to engage lefties very much because they're trolls, right? I always assume when I'm dealing with a lefty that they're trolls because I think that leftism is just one giant troll of civilization, of all that is true, good, beautiful, and all of the rest of that. Leftism is just one giant troll, and so leftists are just trolls, essentially. And you can't try to engage them at a rational level. You just have to respond in like manner. And if they say, are you trolling me or something like that, you say, no, why are you? You always just put it back on them. Do what they do to you, just back on them. Just hold a mirror up to them because you're not going to win that other game. But nevertheless, I hope that this result in the referendum in New Zealand about their flag will shut these idiots up, at least for a while. We'll see. Who knows? And this brings me on to the next topic. Recently, the University of New South Wales, which is one of the biggest, most important universities in Australia, released a diversity toolkit. And I believe this is sort of, it was created from existing things that have been around for quite some time. But basically, this diversity toolkit was about terminology to use when discussing Aborigines and the history of Australia and all of that sort of stuff. So they've come up with a number of things, and I've taken this sort of summary from a newspaper article, though I'll also include a link to the actual this thing put out by the University of New South Wales. But so they have a number of suggestions. So don't say this, say this instead. So for instance, rather than saying Aborigines or Aboriginal, you say Aboriginal people or Aboriginal person. And they say that because you can't lump all Aboriginal people into one category because they're actually separate people, right? I mean, that's actually kind of an interesting thing because they don't see Europeans as having separate regional or national identities. They're all just sort of, bad white people, though race doesn't exist, so I'm not sure how they can be white people. But anyway, that's their weird internal logic. But Aborigines are not one monolithic group, so you have to consider them as separate people, but you don't consider Europeans as a group of separate, distinct people and so on. But anyway, that's how it works, right? Another one is that you don't say that Captain Cook discovered Australia. Captain Cook was a pretty cool guy, actually. He did all sorts of really amazing stuff. One thing that people often don't know about Captain Cook is that he actually went and made maps of Canada. He was all over the place, this guy. He was everywhere. And his maps were used for almost 200 years after he made them. Those maps of Canada, they were so accurate. But he basically discovered enormous parts of the South Pacific and traveled around all over the place and did amazing things. And he's sort of at least when I was growing up, he was kind of like an idol. He was this epic figure in Australian history when I was growing up. Well, these days he's kind of persona non grata, right? So you don't say that he discovered Australia. You say he was the first Englishman to map the East Coast, because he wasn't the first person to discover Australia, because there were Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islanders, and these people who had actually discovered Australia 40,000 years before him, right? Okay. So that's how that works. All right, the next thing that you don't say is that Australia was settled, because that implies that there was nothing there and it was done in a peaceful manner. Well, that's not the truth. Australia was invaded or occupied, right? White people got there and basically displaced people or killed them. So that's what you have to say instead. The next one is, you don't say Aboriginal people have been here for 40,000 years. This one was actually kind of a weird one to me. I thought, what's wrong with that? I couldn't understand what was wrong with that at face value. And the reason for that supposedly is because that locks them into an actual number that, that they've only been here for 40,000 years, or, in Australia for 40,000 years. Supposedly you're supposed to say they have been here since the beginning of the dreamings. The dreamings, I assume that is somehow connected to the dream time, which is their sort of religious, supernatural, spiritual, whatever, metaphysical beliefs about how the world was created and all of this sort of stuff. So you're meant to say that they've been here since the beginning of the dreamings, whatever that means. I don't, they've probably been there, 750 billion trillion years or something, right? It gets bigger every year. Eventually they'll actually find that Aborigines existed before the Big Bang in Australia. The next thing that you're not supposed to talk about is Australian history. You're supposed to talk about either pre-invasion history. I mean, it's so Orwellian. It's like something out of the Soviet Union, this kind of stuff. You're meant to talk about pre-invasion history or post-invasion history, not Australian history, because there's not Australian history. It's, there was this idyllic past, this noble savage land with, or I don't know, maybe you can't even say that these days. There was this Garden of Eden, or maybe you can't say that because that's actually putting a kind of a Western thing on, Western belief system on the Aborigines. Anyway, there was this idyllic past, and then there was all this just horrendous stuff after that. So that's kind of the demarcation line, kind of like BC into AD, except it's kind of like idyllic past, horrible stuff, like IPHS, I guess you put those letters after or before numbers when you tell the date now. So that's kind of some of the stuff that's in this this diversity toolkit. And another sort of a longer thing that you're not meant to say, or why. They said in there, Australia was not settled peacefully, it was invaded, occupied and colonised. Describing the arrival of the Europeans as a settlement attempts to view Australian history from the shores of England rather than the shores of Australia. Well, most people did come from England, so why wouldn't you do that? I don't know. I mean, actually, it's okay, like, if you want to talk about the Somali experience in Australia, or the Afghan refugee experience in Australia, to talk about, their story as beginning in Afghanistan and so on, but, or Somalia, but you can't do that with English descended people and so on and so forth. Now, I mean, of course, all of this it's a complete nonsense, right? But here's the thing. They say that currently these kinds of things are suggestions. They're not compulsory. I mean, we all know what that means, however. Basically, you follow the suggestions if you want to keep your job as an academic or get a good grade as a student. You will be paused for your own good, whether you like it or not. That's just how it is, right? And of course, all of this will slowly start to seep into people's consciousness. As I said, when I was a kid, we used to do all sorts of stuff. I'll tell a really funny story, actually. So in 1788, as I mentioned earlier, that's Civilization Day, right? When civilization was brought to an entire continent. So they had the bicentennial of that in 1988, and there were celebrations for the bicentennial. So I think I was in year 7 at the time. Yeah, I was in year 7. And we must have done this at some later point in the year, because usually the 26th of January, which is Civilization Day, when Australia Day is celebrated, usually that's still during summer vacation in Australia. So this must have occurred later on in the year. I don't know why. Anyway, we had a day when we all came to school in different costumes, and there were various activities and so on for this bicentennial celebration. And so we were supposed to dress up and come to school, and some people actually put effort into their outfits. Most people didn't. They just wore like pajamas with these little arrows on them, which that was sort of meant to represent the a uniform of a convict. Because it was just an easy thing you could do, right? Some people did put effort in. So anyway, I arrived at school, and we had a teacher. He was actually my grade 6 English teacher, and he was also he was a housemaster. So we had these things called houses. They were sort of like these big pastoral care / sporting teams within the school. You were divided up into a number of houses that competed against each other in various things, and they did pastoral care as well. So he was our housemaster, and he was this old dude. He was probably about, and I'd say he was in his late 50s, maybe even his 60s at the time. And he was this crazy guy. He had lived in Papua New Guinea, and he could speak Pidgin. He used to tell us all these really funny things. We'd ask him, how do you say whatever in Pidgin? And he would just like say 2 or 3 sentences in Pidgin, in New Guinean Pidgin. It was hilarious. And he was just this sort of like funny guy. He used to do all these crazy things to you, like if you had to receive a prize, when he shook your hand, he'd always crush your hand, but he wouldn't let go and you'd be squirming and all this sort of stuff. He was this kind of like crazy grandfather figure. Anyway, I arrived at school and he was there with these 2 students. I don't know who these 2 students were. They were younger than me. And all 3 of them were dressed as Aborigines. So picture this guy. He's like 60 years old. He was wearing a loincloth, right? I mean, this is so weird, right, at this suburban private school. He was wearing a loincloth and he had a fake spear. And he and these kids had completely covered themselves from head to toe in something. I don't know what it was, boot polish or something. So they were kind of in blackface, right? So that was when I was, 12 years old, right? That's 28 years ago. Imagine if anyone even considered doing that these days, right? But that was, people thought it was funny, or people just thought, that's, Mr. So-and-so being kind of weird, or that's, he's such a character, that kind of stuff, right? That's how it was received back then when I was a kid. And now we're at the point where it's like, you can't even call them Aborigines anymore, because they're not actually all one monolithic group and, all this nonsense, right? So, that's where we're at as a culture now. And of course, if I actually said to a bunch of school-aged children now, if I told them that story about my teacher and how he had essentially dressed up as in blackface with a spear and a loincloth, they would either think I was lying, or they'd think, oh my God, Australia was just full of Nazis back then. Oh my God, I can't even, you should have given me a trigger warning for that. I need a safe space now. They wouldn't believe that that's how it was only 28 years ago. 28 years ago, I've seen this within my lifetime. This creeping cultural Marxism. It's ridiculous. But look, I'm actually not really sort of triggered by all of this, because it's the standard cultural Marxism that's creeping in. Nothing to see here. Everyone move along. That kind of thing. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't engage lefties on these topics, or if I do, I agree and amplify. So when they talk about, we should call it Invasion Day, not Australia Day, right? Like that. I mean, that's why I call it Civilization Day, right? That's sort of agreeing and amplifying, or not playing into their frame. It's doing the complete opposite, not begging like, oh no, but Australia's this inclusive, multicultural country. It includes everyone now. Don't play into that frame. Just saying, yeah, there was an invasion. Yeah, it was right that the English went to Australia and they conquered Australia and invaded, because the locals were mismanaging the resources there, or they're under-managing the resources, and the English decided to make better use of them. Or you could be kind of sarcastic and say, yeah, look, I agree. It's a terrible thing that the English came to Australia. I do think that modern medicine and high life expectancy, the written word, all of these kinds of things are quite overrated, actually. I suggest that we actually do have a lot to learn from a Stone Age people who, in some places, like in Tasmania, for instance, the Aborigines in Tasmania had actually lost the use of fire. Just think about that for a second. They had lost the use of fire. They didn't know what fire was, right? Those on the mainland still had fire, but you say yes. Look, I think we actually do have an enormous amount to learn from these Stone Age people. They could enlighten us, and we got to be very spiritual and in touch with the earth and the dreaming and all of this other nonsense. And suggest that SJWs and these lefty signalling idiots do so, that they get in touch with the dreaming and the earth and, the great serpent or whatever that thing is, and, go out and live in the desert like these people and, issue all of these horrible legacies of colonialism, such as modern medicine and so on, and shake off their white privilege and their racist, bigoted past and all of this sort of stuff. I mean, I think that's the way to deal with these kinds of idiots, right? As I mentioned earlier, they're trolls, right? Leftists, by definition, are trolls. Anyone who thinks that they're going to have a sensible conversation with the leftists is on hiding to nothing to begin with. So, just troll them back. Just say you're a troll. Either tell them basically where to go or just troll them back. And they'll say, why are you trolling me? And you say, why are you? Just always put it back on them like that. So anyway, I made this talk partly because I saw these things earlier this year, and I was reminded of these also recently with this flag referendum in New Zealand, and I really trolled some of my New Zealand friends pretty hard about this, and there were some funny different designs that I found on the internet of sheep, like badly drawn sheep on their flag, or a kiwi, the little birds they have from New Zealand with these kind of laser beam eyes, and just like really stupid pictures basically. So I trolled them about all of this, but also I received a private message today. So I'm not going to mention who it was, asking for my thoughts on the University of New South Wales handbook or whatever, guidelines about what you should or shouldn't say. So anyway, this was just a very quick talk, hopefully. And as always, please comment beneath this video, and thank you for listening.